You're not a freak, you're beautiful. Mountain Man bought her freedom from the circus. Step right up, folks. 5 cents to see the fattest freak God ever made. The ringmaster's voice cracked like a whip through the dusty evening air of Silverton, Colorado, in the autumn of 1878. Lanterns flickered against the sagging canvas of the traveling circus tent, throwing yellow light over mud, boots, and open mouths. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, men laughed too loudly, and coins clinked from hand to hand as the crowd pressed closer. In the center of the main tent stood a heavy iron cage. A painted sign above it screamed in red letters, "The Mountain of Meat, Nature's Mistake." Inside, on a too small wooden stool, sat Pearl Hawthorne. She was 23, soft and wide-hipped, with thick arms, round cheeks, and dark hair braided down her back. The cheap, tight dress they'd shoved her into pulled at every seam, designed to make her look bigger, stranger, less human. Her brown eyes stared at nothing, fixed on a point beyond the laughing faces, because if she really looked at them, the shame would burn her alive. A tomato, half rotten, smacked against the bars and burst, red pulp splattering her sleeve. Laughter exploded. "Look at her!" a man slurred, breath heavy with whiskey. "I swear she's bigger this week." "She's disgusting," a woman muttered, clutching her little boy closer. "Don't stare too long. You'll have nightmares." The boy stared anyway, wide-eyed and fearful. "Mama, is she real?" Pearl swallowed, her throat tight. She remembered a kitchen table once, and a mother who had called her "my pretty girl," and kissed flour off her nose. That was before sickness took her mother and cards took her father, before he'd sold her to the circus for $30 and a bottle of cheap gin. Now she was the Mountain of Meat. Not Pearl, not a daughter, not a woman, just a show. "Move, you little brats, let a man see the monster," someone barked, shoving forward. Fingers jabbed through the bars, prodding the soft flesh of her arm like she was livestock at auction. "Turn around!" another voice shouted. "Let's see the rest of you." She didn't move. Moving got you slapped. Moving got you mocked louder. Better to stay still and let the storm wash over you. The ringmaster strutted in front of the cage in his red coat and tall hat, grinning like a carving knife. "Ladies and gentlemen, she eats enough for 3 men and still begs for more. Nature's greatest mistake, captured alive just for you. Who here has the courage to get closer?" The crowd surged again, a tide of faces and teeth and pointing hands. And then, from the back of the tent, a different voice cut through the noise. Low, roughened by cold mountain air, it didn't need to shout to be heard. "That's enough." The crowd shifted, heads turned. A tall man stepped into the circle of lamplight, broad shoulders wrapped in a worn leather coat, dark hair hanging to his jaw, a beard framing a face tanned by years of winter sun. His eyes, clear and sharp as ice over a river, locked not on the ringmaster, not on the crowd, but on the girl in the cage. Pearl felt it, for the first time in months, maybe years, someone actually looking at her, not at the sign above her head. "You done staring yet?" the ringmaster sneered. 5 cents if you want a closer look, mountain man." The stranger didn't blink. "I'm not here to stare," he said quietly. "I'm here to ask why there's a human being locked in a cage." The tent fell strangely silent, the laughter dying in throats. Pearl's fingers tightened around the iron bar. Somewhere in the deepest, quietest part of her, something flickered. The tent air felt thicker than wood smoke, heavy with sweat, cheap perfume, and the sour reek of spilled beer. No one moved at first. The stranger's question seemed to hang there, suspended between the iron cage and the painted banners. "Human being?" the ringmaster finally scoffed, recovering his swagger. "She's an attraction, friend, same as the bearded lady and the two-headed calf. Folks pay to see what ain't normal." He swept an arm toward Pearl like a merchant showing off a side of beef. "And she's the best investment I ever made." Pearl stared at the dirt beneath her bare feet, heart pounding harder than it had in months. She knew better than to hope. Men sometimes pretended to be offended to impress their wives or their friends, and then they laughed along with everyone else. But this man, something in his voice had made her look up. He stepped closer, the lamplight catching lines carved by winter and grief around his eyes. Up close, Pearl saw that his leather coat had been mended many times, that his hands were nicked and scarred from rope, knife, and rifle. He carried himself like someone who had spent years walking alone over rock and snow, steady, grounded, unhurried. He glanced once at the sign above her head, then back to the ringmaster. "What's her name?" The question landed like a stone in still water. The ringmaster barked a laugh. "Her name? Folks, did you hear that? He thinks the freak has a name." The crowd tittered uneasily, not sure if they should laugh or stay quiet. Pearl's throat tightened. No one had asked her that in a long time. To the circus, she was the mountain, the hog, the showpiece. Her real name felt like something fragile she kept hidden in the dark, so it wouldn't be taken too. The stranger's gaze flicked to her again, softer this time. "Can you hear me?" he asked quietly. "Do you have a name?" Her tongue felt thick, but the word rose up anyway, like it had been waiting for this moment. "Pearl," she whispered, barely louder than the rustle of sawdust under boots. He leaned in, as if the whole world had narrowed to the few inches between them. "Pearl," he repeated, steady and respectful. "All right." He straightened and turned back to the ringmaster. "My name is Tobias Blackwood. I'm not leaving until she's out of that cage." The ringmaster, Silas Crane, as the painted poster outside proclaimed, chewed on his cigar and squinted. "Blackwood, heard of you. You're the trapper from up in the high country. Folks say you live with wolves and talk to trees." He smirked. "Didn't figure a man who sleeps in snowdrifts would get so sentimental." Tobias's jaw clenched, but his voice stayed low. "This isn't sentiment. It's decency. How much?" Silas's eyes sharpened. Money was a language he understood perfectly. He sauntered closer, lowering his voice so only Tobias in the front row could hear. "She pulls in near $200 a week when we're in a busy town. Folks love to see what makes them feel better about themselves. So if you're thinking you can toss me a little pocket change and walk out with my star attraction, think again." Tobias reached into his coat and laid a worn leather pouch on the nearest crate. It hit with a weighty clink. "100 in silver," he said. "Every fur I sold this season." Silas opened the pouch, coins flashing in the lantern light. Greed flickered in his eyes, then he shook his head slowly. "Not enough. You want novelty? Go buy yourself a dancing chicken. This one's prime stock." Behind the bars, Pearl watched the scene as if it were happening to someone else. Men had haggled over her before, over how much gin her father could get, over how many nights she'd have to work to pay back imaginary debts. She knew the rhythm of barter when the item on the table was her, but this time was wrong. No one had looked at her this way while they argued, like she was the point of the bargain, not just the object. Tobias looked back at her, just for a heartbeat, Pearl saw frustration there, but something else too. Memory, maybe, and a kind of stubborn sorrow. He turned to face Silas fully. "I've got the silver. I've also got a Appaloosa gelding tied out front and a hand-tooled saddle I made myself. Horse is strong, sure-footed in rough country. The outfit's worth 50 at least." Silas's brows rose. His mind moved quickly, counting tickets, towns, and risk. Pearl wasn't as profitable as she had been when they'd first painted the sign. The months of thin food and humiliation had worn her down, stolen some of the shocking roundness the crowds paid to see. If she got sick and died, she'd be worth nothing. 100 in silver, Tobias said quietly, plus the horse and saddle. You won't get a better offer. The ringmaster rolled the cigar between his teeth, eyes flickering from Tobias to the bulging pouch, then to the shadows of the tent where roustabouts loitered and listened. If he refused, he'd have to admit, even to himself, that what he loved wasn't the show. It was owning something no one else did. That kind of pride was expensive. Greed won. "Fine," Silas snapped, "but we do it proper." He jerked open a drawer, pulled out a stained ledger and a scrap of printed contract. "You signed saying you're taking full possession. Once she leaves this tent, she's your problem. No refunds when you realize she eats like 3 farmhands and cries at night." He chuckled at his own joke. No one else did. Tobias didn't dignify it with an answer. He scrawled his name across the paper with a blunt pencil, hand steady, despite the storm he clearly kept on a tight leash inside. Silas dug a key ring from his vest pocket and plucked off a single iron key. He weighed it in his palm, then tossed it lazily. Tobias caught it without looking. "Pleasure doing business, Mr. Blackwood," Silas drawled. "Enjoy your freak." Tobias turned away before the last word had finished echoing. He walked back to the cage through the thinning crowd. Some people were already losing interest, drifting toward the contortionist's stage or the card tables where the real evening sins would be measured out in whiskey and losses. Pearl's heart hammered as he came closer. She wanted to shrink back into the shadows of the cage to make herself small and invisible. At the same time, an ache she'd tried to kill for months, the ache to be touched gently, to be called by her name, rose up, raw and desperate. He stopped within arm's reach of the bars and slipped the key into the lock. His hands were big and scarred, but they moved with surprising care. The mechanism stuck. It hadn't been opened often. He frowned, twisted harder, and with a loud, rusty click, the lock gave. The door swung inward on protesting hinges. For a breath, Pearl didn't move. She'd imagined this so many times in the dark. The door opening, someone saying, "You can go now." In most versions, it had been her mother's hand reaching in. In others, no one had a face at all. Now it was a mountain man with winter in his eyes and her name on his tongue. He stepped just inside the threshold, not close enough to crowd her. Shrugging off his coat, he draped it over his forearm and held it out. "Pearl," he said gently, "you don't have to stay in there any more. Come out. It's cold." Her fingers twitched on the edge of the stool. "Why?" she whispered hoarsely. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." His answer was simple, and it landed deep. "Because you shouldn't have to live behind bars for strangers to feel better about themselves. Because someone should have done this a long time ago." He paused. "Because you deserve better than this, whether you believe it yet or not." The tent felt suddenly too quiet. Even the creak of ropes and flap of canvas faded. Slowly, As if every joint had rusted, Pearl pushed herself to her feet. Her legs trembled under her weight. Tobias didn't rush her. He simply waited, coat still offered, eyes never leaving her face. She took one step, then another. When she reached the doorway, she hesitated, swaying. Tobias moved just enough to steady her elbow, his touch firm but careful. It was the first human touch in months that hadn't meant harm. He settled the coat around her shoulders. It was warm from his body and smelled of pine smoke and leather. "Breathe," he murmured, "one step at a time." Pearl stepped over the threshold. Behind them, the empty cage yawned in the lamplight, iron bars gleaming like the ribs of some dead, hollow beast. Outside the tent, the night waited, cold, uncertain, impossibly wide. The night air outside the circus tent struck Pearl like a wave, cold, sharp, and shockingly clean after months of breathing the sour heat of crowds. She pulled Tobias's heavy coat tighter around her shoulders. It was far too big for her, the hem nearly brushing her ankles, but the weight of it felt protective, like a shield between her and the world. Lanterns from the circus cast flickering halos across the dirt road. Music swelled from the far end of the camp. Fiddles, drunken laughter, the hollow cheer of people seeking distraction and forgetting their own emptiness by mocking someone else's. Pearl flinched at every shout. Tobias noticed. "We'll take the back way," he murmured, quieter. She nodded, not trusting her voice. They moved slowly. Pearl's legs were weak, shaking under her, and the cold bit through her thin dress. Twice she stumbled, and Tobias steadied her each time with a hand gentle enough to make her throat tighten. A horse whinnied from somewhere behind them. Pearl froze. "It's just a wagon team," Tobias assured her quietly. "No one's coming after you." You gave him your horse," Pearl whispered, still not believing it, "and your saddle, and all your money." "He won't use any of it half as well as I did," Tobias said, "but you were worth the price." The words hit Pearl like a blow, not cruel, not mocking, but so impossibly kind that her knees nearly buckled. No one had ever said she was worth anything, worth food, worth time, worth compassion, worth a price. She swallowed hard. "I'm not used to people doing things for me." "That's because the people around you weren't the right ones." Pearl didn't answer. She kept her eyes down as Tobias guided her past the last row of tents, where the circus hands lounged around fire pits. Some of them glanced up, frowning in confusion, but none recognized her under the oversized coat. When they reached the stables at the edge of the camp, a wagon waited. An old, rattling thing with a patched canvas top, pulled by a stocky mule with kind eyes. "I hired it with what silver I had left," Tobias said. "It'll get us up the first stretch before we have to go on foot." Pearl stared at the mule, then at Tobias. "I can walk." "Not tonight," he said quietly. "Your body needs rest. So does your mind." He took her arm again, carefully, always carefully, and helped her climb into the wagon. Blankets were folded neatly in the back. Tobias tucked one around her as she sat, but she tried to push it away. "I'm too heavy," she murmured. "I'll break something." Tobias paused, looking at her with an expression she didn't understand. Pain, anger, gentleness, all tangled together. "Pearl," he said quietly, "listen to me. You are not going to break anything. You are not a burden, and if anyone ever told you that, they lied." Pearl's breath hitched. She looked away, blinking fast. Tobias climbed onto the driver's bench, clicked the reins, and the wagon creaked forward. They rolled out of Silverton under the pale glow of the rising moon, leaving the circus music fading behind them like the echo of a nightmare. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Pearl curled under the blanket, listening to the creak of wheels and the steady clip-clop of the mule's hooves. The rhythm soothed her. For the first time in a half a year, she didn't smell dirty hay, sweat, cheap cigars, or stale beer. Instead, she smelled pine, real pine, sharp and clean. After nearly an hour, Tobias spoke. "You can sleep if you want. We've got a long road ahead." Pearl shook her head. "If I fall asleep, I'm afraid I'll wake up back in the cage." "You won't," Tobias said firmly. "As long as I'm here, no one will put you in a cage again." She didn't reply, but her shoulders eased a fraction. The road narrowed as they left the town limits, winding between dark trees and tall grass swaying in the night wind. Ahead rose the mountains, black silhouettes against the sky, vast and intimidating. Pearl shivered at their size. "You live up there?" she asked softly. "Yes." "Why?" Tobias hesitated. "Because there's no one up there to lose." His voice lowered. "Life took everything from me once, so I went where it couldn't take more." Pearl understood that kind of loss. Not the same kind. His was grief, hers humiliation, but the emptiness felt familiar. They rode a while longer. When the mule began to slow on the incline, Tobias clicked his tongue softly. "Almost there," he murmured. "We'll stop by the river for the night." Pearl's heart twitched. Are you sure I'm not slowing you down?" "You're walking the same road as me," he said. "There is no slowing." A moment later he added, "Pearl, may I tell you something?" "Yes. When I saw you in that cage, I didn't see shame or freakishness or anything the sign said." His hands tightened on the reins. "I saw someone who had survived things that would break most people." Pearl felt heat prick behind her eyes. She turned slightly, the moon catching her face. "Tobias, why did you really save me?" He looked at her, then really looked, his eyes a storm of old hurt and quiet determination. "Because no one saved the people I loved," he said softly, "and I wasn't going to let that happen again." The mule slowed as they reached a clearing near the river, and Tobias set the brake. Pearl breathed in the cold air, feeling the faintest flicker of something she had not felt in years. Possibility. "Pearl," Tobias said quietly as he reached to help her down, "from here on, every step you take belongs to you, not to that circus, not to anyone who hurt you before." She nodded slowly. The moon shone on the river, on the trees, on her trembling hands. For the first time, she wondered what freedom might feel like. The cabin came into view just as the first light of dawn touched the tops of the pines. Pearl's breath caught. After months of iron bars and trampled sawdust floors, the sight of a little wooden home tucked among trees felt almost unreal. Smoke curled softly from the chimney. A wooden porch wrapped around one side, with a rocking chair resting beside a stack of split logs. The cabin wasn't large, but it looked solid, built by steady hands with no one to impress and nothing to prove. Tobias halted the mule and climbed down. "We're here." Pearl hesitated, afraid to step out of the wagon, as if the moment her feet touched the ground, the dream might dissolve. Tobias stepped toward her and offered his hand. "Come on, take it slow." She placed her trembling fingers in his palm. His hand was warm, rough from work, steady as a tree root. He helped her down gently, making sure she didn't stumble on the uneven earth. Her legs wobbled, but this time she stayed upright. Tobias retrieved the bedding, supplies, and the few belongings she'd had at the circus. Nothing more than a patched dress, a thin shawl, and a hairbrush, missing half its bristles. He carried them inside, then returned to the doorway. "You can come in whenever you're ready." Pearl took a breath. The doorway felt like a threshold between two lives. When she stepped inside, her senses filled with warmth, real warmth, not the suffocating heat of a packed tent, but the soft crackle of a hearth fire casting golden light across the wooden floor. The room was simple. A sturdy table with mismatched chairs, shelves lined with jars of dried herbs and preserves, a thick rug in front of the fireplace, a pot simmering faintly on the stove. It smelled of pine, smoke, and safety. Pearl's eyes filled with tears she didn't want Tobias to see. She turned away, pretending to study the shelves. Tobias wiped his boots and set her things on a chair. "This'll be your room." He opened a small door off the main space. Pearl peeked in. A bed, a real bed, wide enough for her body, covered with a thick quilt, a small window with a view of the trees, a nightstand made from a polished stump, and a pitcher with clean water. "This is for me?" she whispered. "Of course." Tobias hesitated. No one should sleep on a floor unless they choose to. She stepped inside, touching the edge of the quilt. "It's beautiful." "It's simple," he said quietly, "but it's yours." She closed her eyes. The word yours felt like honey on a wound. For the first couple of days, Pearl mostly stayed in her room. She sat on the bed with her knees hugged to her chest, listening to the unfamiliar silence. No shouting crowd, no ringmaster's bark, no slamming cage door. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt exposed, like she didn't know how to exist without constant humiliation pressing her down. Tobias didn't push her. He cooked meals, the warm smell drifting to her room, venison stew, cornbread, roasted potatoes. He knocked lightly before setting a plate on the table and stepping back. "Food's ready," he'd say, then return to chopping wood or mending tools. Pearl would emerge quietly, eat in silence, then retreat again. She expected Tobias to get frustrated, to demand she help with chores, or to question her weight and eating the way her father always had. He never did. On the fourth morning, she found him outside sharpening an axe on the porch. Frost glittered on the grass. His breath curled in the cold air as he worked, slow and methodical. Pearl stepped out hesitantly, wrapped in the coat he'd lent her. "You're up early," he said, glancing over. I want to help," she murmured. He paused. "Help with what?" "Anything. Cooking, cleaning, carrying wood." Her voice dipped. "I don't want to be a burden." Tobias lowered the axe and studied her face for a long moment. "Pearl," he said gently, "you're not a burden. You're someone who needs rest. That's different." "But I can't just sit while you do everything," she insisted softly. A small smile tugged at his mouth. "All right. How about we start with something simple?" He handed her a basket. "Would you mind fetching a few herbs from the garden patch out back? The mint and sage are still holding through the cold." Pearl nodded, relieved to have a task that didn't require strength or speed. When she stepped outside to the little patch of earth behind the cabin, she felt the sun touch her face. The rows of herbs, even in the fading season, looked vibrant. Greens and silvers and purples still clinging to life. She knelt and breathed in the earthy scent. Something about it grounded her. For the first time in months, She felt her heartbeat slow into something calm. When she returned with the basket full, Tobias looked impressed. "That's perfect," he said. "Thank you." Her chest warmed. She couldn't remember the last time someone thanked her for anything. That night, after dinner, Tobias lit a lantern and handed it to her. "Want to see the stream?" he asked. "It's close, safe." Pearl hesitated, but something in his voice, hopeful, patient, made her nod. They walked side by side through the trees, the cold air nipping at their cheeks. The forest glowed softly in the moonlight, and when they reached the stream, it sparkled like liquid silver. Pearl stared at it with wide eyes. She had never been this far from town, never seen mountains like these up close. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "So are you," Tobias murmured. Her breath caught. She turned her face away, heat blooming in her cheeks. No one had ever said that to her without cruelty in their voice. "You don't have to say things like that," she said softly. "I only say what's true." They stood in silence for a long time, listening to the water. Finally, Pearl asked the question she'd been afraid to bring up. "Tobias, what do you expect me to do here? I mean, what am I supposed to be now?" He took a moment before answering. "Whatever you want." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one that doesn't put you in another cage," he said gently. "You're free now, truly free. If you want to stay, stay. If one day you want to leave, you leave. If you want to learn, I'll teach you. If you want to forget, I'll give you time. You choose your life." Pearl's throat tightened painfully. She hadn't chosen anything in years. A tear slid down her cheek. Without asking, Tobias handed her a handkerchief. "You okay?" She nodded, though her voice shook. I don't know how to take kindness. It feels strange." "You'll get used to it," he said softly. "You deserve more of it than you've been given." She looked at him then. Really looked. His face was rough and tired, marked by a life of loss. But his eyes were steady and kind. For the first time, Pearl let herself believe she might be safe. "Come on," Tobias said gently. "Let's get you warm. Tomorrow, if you'd like, I can show you how to split kindling. Only if you want." She found herself smiling, small, fragile, but real. "I'd like that." As they walked back toward the cabin, Pearl felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Winter came early that year. By late October, snow clung to the pine branches like white velvet, and the air grew sharp enough to sting Pearl's cheeks whenever she stepped outside. She didn't mind. For the first time in her life, she wasn't shivering because of fear, but because of weather. Simple, natural, ordinary weather. Tobias kept the cabin warm and the pantry full. He taught her how to stack firewood so it dried properly, how to season a stew with wild herbs, how to trap small game humanely. In return, Pearl cooked, tended the pantry, swept the floors, and mended his shirts. It was the closest thing to partnership she had ever known. But as the days shortened, so did Tobias. At night, Pearl would hear him pacing in the room next to hers. Sometimes she caught him rubbing his chest, breath shallow, eyes distant, as if memories gnawed at him from inside. One evening, while she stirred a pot of venison and barley, Tobias sat at the table sharpening his knife. The rhythmic scrape of steel against stone filled the cabin. Pearl tried not to stare, but the tension in his shoulders was impossible to ignore. "Something's bothering you," she said quietly. He paused mid-stroke. "Just tired." "That isn't the truth," she whispered. Tobias's jaw tightened. He set the knife down, the blade gleaming in firelight. Some things don't leave a man in peace no matter how far he runs. Pearl dried her hands on her apron and sat across from him. Then don't run. Tell me. He hesitated. For a long moment, she thought he'd refuse. Then he exhaled, as though releasing air he'd held for years. My wife's name was Emma. Pearl's heart sank. She'd known he had loved someone once, but hearing her name made it real. She died 5 winters ago, Tobias continued, voice low. Disease swept through the settlement, took her in 2 days, took our baby in 1. Pearl reached across the table, touching the back of his hand. I'm so sorry. His fingers curled reflexively around hers. I couldn't save them. I was out checking traps, came home to... He didn't finish. Pearl squeezed his hand gently. Tobias swallowed and looked at her, really looked at her, like he was seeing something he hadn't expected. You remind me nothing of her, he said softly. That's a good thing. Sometimes a man needs something completely different to keep living. Pearl felt warmth rush through her chest, mingled with a flicker of fear. Fear of wanting too much. I'm not replacing anyone, she whispered. No, he said. You're not. You're giving me something I thought I'd lost forever. She blinked. What's that? Hope. The next morning, Tobias went into town for supplies. Pearl stayed behind to tend the fire and wash clothes. She hummed softly as she worked, her breath creating little clouds in the cold air of the porch. She had just finished hanging a blanket when a sound snapped through the trees, branches cracking, heavy footsteps, men's voices. Pearl stiffened. Before she could hide, 3 figures emerged from the forest edge. Her blood turned to ice. Silas Crane, and 2 circus men she recognized, the strong man with the crooked nose and the roustabout with the scarred cheek. Well, well, Silas drawled, tapping ash off his cigar. If it isn't my star attraction. Pearl backed up until her spine hit the cabin wall. You can't be here. Oh, but I can. Silas spread his arms mockingly. You think a scrap of paper and a handful of coins means anything? You were my property, and I want you back. I'm free now. You think that mountain rat made you free? Freedom doesn't exist for creatures like you. Silas stepped closer. You're an investment, and investments return profit. Terror clawed up Pearl's throat, but she forced herself to stand taller. Tobias will be back any minute. Silas smirked. Good. Then he can watch me drag you back into a cage. The strong man moved first, lunging forward, grabbing Pearl by the arm. Pain shot up her shoulder. She gasped, struggling, but he was too strong. Let go, she cried. Oh, you've gotten loud, Silas sneered. 6 months ago you barely spoke. Guess the mountain man's been feeding you courage. Shame he won't be able to protect you. Pearl kicked, twisting free for 1 second. Then a gunshot cracked the air. The strong man froze. Another shot split a pine branch clean in half, 2 inches from Silas's ear. The forest went dead silent. Tobias stepped out from behind the trees, rifle raised, eyes blazing with a fury Pearl had never seen in him. Touch her again, he said, voice low and lethal, and I'll bury all 3 of you before the snow melts. Silas laughed nervously. Now, Blackwood, no need for dramatics. We're just collecting what's rightfully. Tobias fired. The bullet hit the dirt an inch from Silas's boot. One more word, Tobias growled, and the next one goes in your leg. Silas paled. The strong man loosened his grip. Pearl tore away, stumbling toward Tobias. He reached her in 2 strides, pulling her behind him, shielding her with his body. "You all right?" he murmured, not taking his eyes off the intruders. Pearl nodded shakily. Silas raised his hands. "This is a misunderstanding." "No," Tobias said. "This is trespassing. Come back here again, and it'll be your last mistake." Silas read the truth in Tobias's face and in the rifle leveled at his heart. He swallowed, signaling his men to retreat. "We'll be back," he spat, "and next time we won't be polite." "Next time," Tobias replied, "I won't warn you." The men disappeared into the trees. For a long time, Tobias didn't move. He stared after them, rifle still raised, breath steady but heavy. Pearl stood behind him, trembling. Finally, he turned. His voice was soft. "He hurt you?" "No," she whispered. "Not this time." Tobias stepped closer. "Pearl, I won't let them take you. Not ever." She pressed her forehead to his chest, tears soaking into his shirt. "I was so scared." His hand slid to the back of her head, drawing her into him. "I know. I'm here." "Why won't they leave us alone?" she whispered. "Because some men can't stand losing power over someone they think is beneath them." He tilted her chin up gently until her eyes met his. "But you're not beneath anyone, not anymore." Pearl's breath shook. "I don't want to go back." "You won't," Tobias said. "Not while I'm alive." Her heart thudded painfully at the quiet ferocity in his voice. "Tobias," she whispered, voice breaking, "thank you." He rested his forehead against hers. "We're not done with them, but we'll face whatever comes. Together." Pearl closed her eyes. For the first time, the fear didn't crush her, because she wasn't facing it alone. The next days passed in a fragile quiet, like the stillness before a storm. Tobias set new traps, tightened the locks on the doors, and checked his rifle twice each morning. Pearl did her best to keep the cabin warm, to cook meals, to carry on as if nothing had changed, but fear gnawed at her every time she looked toward the woods. Silas wouldn't give up. Men like him never did. 3 nights after the encounter, Pearl awoke to the distant howl of wolves. She sat up in bed, heart racing. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. She wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped into the hallway. "Tobias?" she whispered. No answer. She found him sitting at the kitchen table, rifle across his lap. His eyes were alert, jaw tight. "They're coming," he said quietly. Pearl's breath caught. "You saw them?" "Tracks in the snow, 3 pairs, heading this way." Her hand shook. "What do we do?" Tobias stood, gripping her shoulders gently. "You go to the cellar. Lock the door behind you. Don't come out until I say. I won't leave you alone." "You're not leaving me. You're letting me protect you." "But," his voice softened, "Pearl, you're carrying my child. I need you safe." The words stunned her. He'd said them before in passing, in moments of tenderness, but now they became iron, heavy, real, binding. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, a sound cut through the night. Boots crunching in the snow. Then another pair. Then voices. Tobias pushed Pearl gently toward the cellar door. "Go, now." She hesitated only a second before obeying. The wooden steps creaked under her feet as she descended into the dark. From above, she heard Tobias slide a heavy beam across the front door, securing it. Then, a loud crash. Silas's voice rang out, "Blackwood, we know you're inside!" Pearl covered her mouth with both hands. Gunshots ripped through the night, splintering the doorframe. Tobias returned fire, the thunder of his rifle shaking dust from the cellar beams. Someone screamed. One of Silas's men hit. Get him! Silas roared. The fight raged above her. Heavy boots pounded the floor. Furniture toppled. Tobias grunted in pain. Pearl pressed her ear to the cellar door, trembling. "Tobias!" she cried before she could stop herself. A fist slammed into the other side of the door. "Well, well," Silas growled. "The little freak is hiding." Pearl stumbled back. The wood cracked once, twice. Pearl's pulse hammered. If Silas reached her, if Tobias fell. No, she wouldn't let that happen. Her eyes darted around the cellar. Tobias's old tools hung on the walls, axes, shovels, a rusty pick. Pearl grabbed the heaviest thing she could lift, the splitting axe Tobias used for firewood. Her arms trembled under its weight, but she held it. Above her, another gunshot. Tobias groaned. Her fear snapped. She ran up the steps and slammed her shoulder into the cellar door. It burst open. Silas spun around, shock flickering across his features. "You—" Pearl didn't let him finish. With a scream torn from years of humiliation, years of torment, she raised the axe. Silas lunged to grab her, but she swung first. The blade sliced across his arm. He howled, stumbling back. "Pearl, no!" Tobias shouted from across the room, wrestling with the strong man. Silas snarled. "You think that hurts? I'm going to drag you back in a cage where you belong." Pearl didn't retreat. For the first time in her life, she stood her ground. "I don't belong to you," she said, voice shaking but strong. "I never did," Silas charged. Pearl gripped the axe with both hands and brought it down on the floorboards in front of him. The shock wave stopped him short, forcing him to stumble backward. Tobias took the opening. He slammed into Silas, knocking him flat. The two crashed into the table, sending plates and lanterns flying. Tobias pinned Silas with one arm and pressed the barrel of his rifle against the man's chest. "Touch her again," Tobias said, breath ragged, "and the wolves will feast on what's left of you." Silas froze. Outside, the sheriff's whistles pierced the night. Tobias had sent a message earlier in the day with a trapper who passed through. He'd known Silas would return. The lanterns of deputies flickered outside the windows. The strong man tried to run, but deputies grabbed him. Silas was hauled to his feet, bleeding and cursing. "You haven't seen the last of me," he shrieked. Tobias didn't even look at him. His attention was on Pearl, who stood trembling, axe still in her grip, tears streaking down her cheeks. He crossed the room in 3 strides, took her face gently between his hands. "Pearl," he whispered, voice breaking, "you saved me." She shook her head, sobbing. "I was so scared." "But you didn't hide." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though the world itself might try to steal her away. "You're safe," he murmured into her hair. "You're safe here." Pearl clung to him, the weight of the night finally crashing down. For the first time, fear didn't win. She did. The sheriff's lanterns faded down the mountain trail, carrying Silas and his men far away at last. When the final echo of hooves vanished into the night, the cabin fell into deep, trembling silence. Pearl stood in the center of the room, still gripping the axe, her breath uneven. Splinters, broken dishes, and streaks of blood lay scattered across the floorboards. The storm had passed, but its shadow lingered in the air. Tobias gently removed the axe from her hands. "It's over," he whispered. "You can breathe now." She pressed her palms to her face and let out a sob, not of fear, but of release. Tobias pulled her into his chest, holding her as tightly as she needed. "You were brave," he murmured, "braver than you know." She shook her head into his shirt. "I wasn't brave. I was terrified." "Courage isn't the absence of fear," he said softly, lifting her chin until her tear-filled eyes met his. It's standing anyway. Pearl exhaled shakily. Tobias's thumb brushed her cheek, wiping away the wetness. His touch was gentle, reverent, as if she were something precious, something worth saving. Come sit by the fire, he said. He helped her to the hearth, where the flames still glowed low and orange. Tobias added a few logs until the fire crackled warm again, filling the room with a soft amber light. Pearl wrapped herself in one of the blankets he'd woven years ago. Tobias sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed. Minutes passed in quiet. Outside, snow drifted softly against the window. Inside, the warmth slowly eased the tremors in her hands. Tobias, she whispered, voice raw, I thought he was going to take me. I thought I'd lose everything, lose you. Tobias's breath caught. He turned fully toward her, eyes dark with emotion. You won't lose me. You don't know that. I do. His tone was quiet, but unshakable. This cabin isn't just a shelter anymore. It's a home because you're here, and I'm not going anywhere. Something in her chest loosened, something knotted and aching for years. She looked down at her hands, then back at Tobias. No one's ever stood up for me before, she whispered. No one's ever fought for me. I didn't think I was worth fighting for. Tobias reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. You're worth the world, Pearl. Her breath trembled. Sometimes I still feel like the girl in the cage. You're not in a cage anymore, he said, and you never will be again, not if I have breath in my lungs. Pearl blinked away new tears. Tobias brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, his thumb lingering along her cheek. His voice softened to a whisper. All of this is yours. The fire, the walls, the quiet, the safety, if you want it. She swallowed. You're saying I can stay? I'm saying, he took a slow breath, it's your home now, if you'll have it. Her eyes widened, glistening with fragile hope. The firelight flickered across her face, illuminating the moment everything changed. Pearl leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. I'll have it, she whispered. I'll have all of it. Tobias closed his eyes, relief and warmth washing through him. He rested his cheek on her hair, his arm wrapping securely around her. Outside, snow kept falling. Inside, two souls, once broken, once lost, sat together by the fire, no longer alone, no longer running, no longer caged, just beginning. Stories like Pearl's remind us that dignity can survive even the harshest winters, and that kindness, offered by just one person, can change the course of a life. Every day, I read your comments from different countries, different cities, different corners of the world, and I'm reminded that despite our distances, our hearts recognize the same truths. We all long to be seen, to be safe, to be loved. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And if you still believe that compassion can mend what cruelty breaks, stay with me. The next story is already waiting for you.